The morning began with a mistake so small it barely seemed worth noticing. A missing name on the roster. 20 recruits had been scheduled to report to the firing range at Coronado that day. 19 showed up. The instructors counted heads, called roll twice, then shrugged it off. It wasn't the first time a trainee had fallen ill or been reassigned at the last minute. What no one questioned was the man already sitting at the far end of the bleachers. He had been there when the first recruits arrived, alone, hunched slightly forward, sipping from a dented steel thermos. He wasn't in uniform. He didn't wear a badge. He hadn't signed in with the instructors. At a glance, he looked like any other civilian. Perhaps maintenance staff, perhaps an old veteran visiting his grandson. Nobody knew. Nobody asked. The recruits were too focused on their own nerves to pay much attention. At week 5 of training, they were halfway through the brutal gauntlet that forged candidates into Navy SEALs. They had just survived Hell Week, that endless blur of freezing water, sand, exhaustion, and pain. Most still carried raw blisters across their feet and bruises on their forearms, but they had begun to believe they were tough enough to make it. Surviving Hell Week had given them a kind of fragile confidence, the kind young men wear like borrowed armor. And so, when they noticed the old man on the bench, their first instinct wasn't caution, but humor. Probably base maintenance, one recruit muttered, tightening the strap on his rifle sling. Or waiting for his grandson, another said, smirking. Thermos guy looks like he came here to critique our posture. A few snickered. The man didn't react. He didn't even look their way. He just sat there quietly, his cap pulled low over his brow, his jacket zipped tight against the morning fog. His silence made him seem less real, almost like part of the landscape. The range itself had its own weight of silence. Not the kind that feels peaceful, but the kind that buzzes just beneath the surface, as if the air is holding its breath before something breaks it. A gray marine layer clung to the gravel and concrete pads like frost. The fog dimmed the edges of the targets, lined in neat, rows down range. Each man felt the tension in the air, though none said it aloud. Chief Larson, the lead instructor, wasted no time with introductions or explanations. He barked through the morning brief with the clipped authority of a man who had delivered the same words 100 times before. Chamber checks, distances, target rotations, grouping expectations. The recruits echoed back the cadence in unison, some with conviction, others still rubbing sleep from their eyes. The stranger did not so much as shift on the bench. A few more recruits noticed him then. Their whispers rippled through the line. Who's that guy? No idea. Logistics maybe. Doesn't even have a badge. Weird. It would have been easy for an instructor to clear the air with a single explanation, but none of them did. Chief Larson ignored the man. Chief Maddox, the sniper-turned-evaluator, who had seen enough ranges to last a lifetime, glanced at the bench once, frowned faintly, then looked away. Whatever flicker of recognition passed over his face, he didn't share. The drills began. One by one, recruits were sent to the line. Their rifles cracked through the fog, sharp reports echoing off the surrounding compound. 10 targets, 20 rounds. Precision over speed, though the instructors timed each shot anyway. Every recruit carried the weight of invisible eyes, the instructors their peers, and the silent figure on the bench who never flinched at the sound of gunfire. It didn't take long before the banter returned. Some of the recruits still needed humor to disguise their nerves. As one of them stepped off the line after a shaky performance, his friend Ramirez, short-tempered, quick with a joke, turned toward the bleachers. "Hey, old-timer," Ramirez called out, grinning. "Enjoying the show? Want me to autograph your hearing aid?" A few recruits laughed. The man didn't even blink. If anything changed, it wasn't visible in him, but in the air around the range. Maddox glanced back again, longer this time, as if chasing the edges of an old memory. Larson paused in his notes, then resumed, his jaw set tighter than before. The recruits didn't notice, but the instructors did. It was only a moment later, when the man shifted his weight on the bench, that something new revealed itself. As he raised his thermos, the sleeve of his windbreaker pulled back just far enough for a faded patch to catch the light. Most of the recruits didn't see it, but Maddox did. Larson did. A golden trident, sun-bleached and nearly worn to threads, barely clinging to the fabric. The seal insignia. It wasn't the kind you saw in a gift shop or on ceremonial jackets. It was real, old, earned. The instructors exchanged a look across the range. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. The day, they both realized, was not going to unfold as scheduled. The recruits, still oblivious, continued their drills. Some shots rang true, others missed wide. Jokes and curses mixed with the reports of gunfire. But more than once, pairs of young eyes flicked back toward the bench, unsettled now in ways they couldn't explain. And through it all, the stranger never spoke, never moved more than to sip from his dented thermos, and never once removed that faded cap. He was just there, an unmoving shadow at the edge of their world. What none of them knew yet was that before the sun reached its highest point in the sky, that same silent figure would step onto their line, pick up a rifle half of them could barely control, and do something none of them would forget. For now, though, he was just the stranger on the bench. The morning drills were supposed to be routine. Every recruit had done variations of them before. Live fire exercises, targets set at staggered distances, rifles loaded with the weight of both ammunition and expectation. The instructors called it muscle memory reinforcement. The recruits called it finally something worth the bruises. Chief Larson's voice carried across the range like gravel poured on steel. He reminded them of the rules, of chamber checks, of timing. Discipline before speed. Accuracy first. His tone left no room for interpretation. Beside him, Chief Maddox jotted notes on a clipboard, his eyes flicking between the recruits and the man still seated at the edge of the bleachers. The recruits filed into position. They were restless, eager to prove themselves after weeks of being pushed to their breaking points. For the first time in days, the range offered them something that felt familiar. A rifle in the hands of a young man often creates the illusion of control, and many of them embraced it like armor against exhaustion. The stranger did not move. When the first recruit stepped up, he tightened his grip as if wringing out nerves. The buzzer sounded. 10 targets. 20 rounds. His shots were uneven. 2 rang true, 3 scattered wide, the rest middling enough to pass. Larson called out the score with the flat tone of a man unimpressed. Next. The rhythm took shape. One after another, they rotated through. Some managed tight groupings that drew nods of approval. Others stumbled. Their reloads fumbled. Their breathing unsteady. Maddox corrected stances, adjusted elbows, called out wind drift. The sun began to climb, thinning the fog into streaks that clung stubbornly to the ground. But even as the range filled with the staccato crack of rifles, attention kept drifting back to the figure on the bench. He hadn't shifted once. His thermos rested loosely in one hand, his other palm balanced on his knee. He might have been a statue for how little he reacted to the concussive bursts around him. A few recruits chuckled under their breath, their laughter nervous, this time, not bold. They didn't know why, but his silence had started to feel heavier than the noise of the range. Ramirez noticed it most. Always the loud one, always ready with a quip to cover his own uncertainty. He felt the man's stillness, like a dare. As he stepped off the line after a jammed reload cost him time, his frustration flared. He glanced toward the bleachers, raised his voice just enough to be heard over the ringing in their ears. "Hey, old-timer," he called out. "Enjoying the show? Want me to autograph your hearing aid when we're done?" Laughter rippled through a few of the recruits. Even Larson, clipboard in hand, glanced up briefly. But the man didn't so much as twitch. He neither frowned nor smiled. He didn't even look in Ramirez's direction. Something shifted then, though few could have put words to it. The silence after Ramirez's outburst felt different, like the air itself had grown heavier. Maddox's eyes lingered on the man longer than before, his brow furrowed in thought. Larson, too, paused over his notes, his lips tightening before he forced his gaze back to the recruits. And still, the drills continued. By the 4th rotation, fatigue began to show. Arms trembled. Shots went wide. The instructors corrected form with sharper words, less patience. Sweat dripped down temples. The morning sun broke free from the fog, casting the range in sharp relief. And through it all, the stranger remained unmoved, his silence louder now than any instructor's bark. Then came the slip. One of the younger recruits, his nerves already fraying, fumbled his sling. As he stumbled, his rifle fired a round into the gravel just feet from the line. The report cracked like thunder. Dust jumped from the ground. Shouts erupted. Ceasefire. Chambers clear. The instructors swarmed in, hands raised, orders shouted with practiced authority. Recruits froze, rifles pointed skyward, magazines ejected. The accidental discharge hadn't hit anyone, but it sent a ripple of unease down the line. For weeks, they had been told that mistakes at this stage could mean lives in the field. Now, they had felt the weight of it. The mood soured quickly. Jokes died. Confidence faltered. Even the cocky smirks disappeared as silence reclaimed the range. And it was in that silence that the stranger finally moved. He stood with no urgency, no sign of frustration or authority, just a steady rise from the bleachers. His boots crunched against the gravel with a rhythm that seemed deliberate, measured. Every head turned as he walked, step by step, toward the line. "Sir, this is a live fire zone," Larson said sharply, raising a hand to intercept him. But the man didn't stop. He walked until the trident patch on his sleeve caught the sunlight, faded, worn, unmistakable. He paused just short of the threshold, his eyes sweeping the range, steady and unimpressed. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, but carried with a weight no recruit could ignore. "You said the record still stands, right?" Larson blinked. "Which record?" 10 shots, 10 targets. 3 distances. Under 15 seconds. Maddox froze. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. "That record hasn't been touched in 8 years. The man's gaze shifted briefly toward him, then back to the targets. "I know," he said. "I said it." The words hung in the air, heavier than the misfire, heavier than the gunpowder that still lingered on the wind. Every recruit on the line stared, unsure if this was some elaborate test or a story playing out in real time. The man stepped forward, his presence changing the rhythm of the day entirely. The drills, the scores, the chatter, all of it faded into something smaller. Something about him, about the quiet certainty in his voice, told them none of this was routine anymore. And for the first time since dawn, no one dared to laugh. For a long moment, no one moved. The recruits stood frozen in their lanes, rifles held awkwardly, as if they no longer trusted themselves with the weight. The instructors, men who had long ago learned to command any situation with a single word, found their voices caught in their throats. The man with the faded jacket and dented thermos had changed everything with a single sentence. "I said it." He stepped past Larson's outstretched hand, not with arrogance, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had already been here before. He walked toward the rack, where an M110 rested in its cradle, a standard-issue rifle that still looked too large in the hands of most recruits. Without hesitation, he picked it up. The way his fingers closed around the stock was different, practiced, effortless. He didn't examine the weapon, didn't fidget with the sights. He handled it like a carpenter picking up a familiar hammer, as if its weight was already part of him. The range went silent in a way no order could have demanded. The usual nervous banter was gone. No jokes, no whispers. Even Ramirez, quick with a quip at any cost, stood still, his jaw set tight. Maddox exchanged a glance with Larson. The look carried more than words. "Do we stop this? Do we let it happen?" In the end, Maddox gave a slight nod, the kind of man gives when he realizes he is about to witness something he'll never see again. Larson stepped forward, voice clipped, formal. "Shooter ready?" The man didn't answer with words. He gave a single nod. The buzzer chirped. The first shot rang out like the starting note of a song. A sharp metallic clang followed an instant later, as the first steel plate shuddered on impact. Before the echo had faded, the second shot cracked. Then the third. His rhythm was uncanny, not frantic, not hurried, but unbroken, like a heartbeat steady under pressure. 4, 5, 6. Each target fell as if it had been waiting for him. He didn't jerk between positions the way the recruits did, wasting energy in corrections. His movements were small, precise, almost invisible. A shift of the elbow, a narrowing of the eye, a twitch of the finger. It was less like watching someone aim and fire and more like watching a memory play itself out through him. 7. 8. He reloaded in a single motion, so clean it barely registered as separate from the firing itself. The magazine slammed home with a click that seemed rehearsed 1,000 times before, the kind of motion performed when life itself once depended on speed. 9. And then the final shot, target 10 at the farthest distance, a plate half hidden by the glare of the morning sun. A whisper of wind rippled across the range, the kind of subtle gust that threw off recruits daily. He didn't pause, didn't squint, didn't calculate with pen and paper. He adjusted in the smallest of movements, lifted the rifle, and squeezed. 10. The final plate rang clear, the tone carrying across the entire range like a bell calling the end of something sacred. The buzzer chirped again. The clock on the screen blinked, 13.2 seconds. No misses. No wasted motion. A record broken by more than a full second. For the span of several breaths, no one moved. The rifle lowered, smoke curling faintly from its barrel, and he held it loosely, like it weighed nothing at all. Then, with the same calm with which he had begun, he set it down on the bench. He didn't raise his arms, didn't grin, didn't even look at the stunned recruits. He simply stepped back from the line, as if what he had done meant little more than stretching his legs. Larson's jaw was clenched, his clipboard hanging forgotten at his side. Maddox exhaled slowly, as if he had been holding the air in his chest for all 13 seconds. The recruits, young men who had survived weeks of pain, who believed themselves hard and unshakable, stood in silence, their pride stripped raw by something they could neither mock nor dismiss. One of them finally whispered, barely audible, "Who the hell is this guy?" The man gave no answer. He didn't need to. He picked up his thermos from the bleachers, took another slow sip, and sat down again as if nothing had happened. But nothing on that range was the same anymore. The laughter didn't return. The recruits didn't swap sarcastic comments. Even Ramirez, who had mocked him minutes earlier, stared at the man with something like reverence in his eyes. The air felt heavier, charged, as if the simple act of breathing required permission. Maddox broke the silence first, his voice low, almost reverent. "That's not muscle memory," he murmured, half to himself. "That's something else." Larson didn't respond. He was already watching the man again, something unspoken rising in his expression. For the recruits, the range had transformed from a classroom into a cathedral. They had just seen perfection stripped of ego, displayed in silence. And though the man hadn't told them who he was, though he hadn't explained his presence, they all felt it in their bones. Whoever he was, he belonged to a different world than theirs, a world they barely understood. And as the last plate swayed gently in the breeze, the lesson was only beginning. The range stayed frozen in the silence left behind by that final shot. No one dared step forward, not even the instructors, who normally would have reset the course within seconds. The steel plate at the far distance still rocked gently, its movement a quiet reminder that what they had just witnessed wasn't a trick or an exaggeration. It was real. The recruits stood there awkwardly, rifle slung, magazine still in hand, as if they had been told to pause and hadn't yet been released. For the first time since Hell Week, the bravado was gone. The cocky jokes, the muttered insults, the eye rolls vanished. Every man there understood, even if they couldn't yet articulate it, that they had just been given a glimpse of something far beyond their training. The man had already set his rifle down and walked back to the bleachers. He moved without ceremony, without so much as a glance at the faces staring at him. He sat, unscrewed the cap of his thermos, and took a sip. To him, it seemed 13 seconds of perfection had been nothing more than stretching a forgotten muscle. Chief Larson approached him slowly, clipboard dangling useless in his hand. He stopped in front of the bleachers, eyes narrowed, words caught behind his teeth. Finally, he spoke. "Why today?" he asked. His tone wasn't sharp now, not commanding. It was curious, almost careful. The man looked up, the brim of his cap casting a shadow over eyes the color of dull steel. He didn't answer right away. He glanced back toward the targets, at the plates swaying faintly in the morning breeze. His reply came quiet, but firm enough to cut through the silence. Because I wanted to see if I still could. It wasn't a boast. It wasn't even a statement of pride. It was closer to a confession, the kind that carries its own gravity. Larson nodded slowly, lowering his clipboard. He had heard men speak like that before, not about scores, not about records, but about survival. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about facing yourself. A few feet away, Chief Maddox was staring at the rifle still resting on the bench. He traced a finger along the chamber, his face unreadable. His voice was barely above a whisper when he spoke. That wasn't practice, he said. That was instinct. That was, he stopped himself, as though finishing the thought would make it too real. Meanwhile, the recruits began to murmur. The spell of silence had broken, and now the whispers spread like fire across the line. Did you see that? 13 seconds. No misses. Who even is he? Phones were already out. Searches beginning. It didn't take long. Instructors may have kept their mouths shut, but databases didn't lie. Within minutes, one of the younger recruits read aloud from a screen. Master Chief Evan Cole. SEAL Team 6. Retired 15 years ago. The name hung in the air like a banner. Some recruits blinked, others frowned in recognition, as if the name rang faint bells from stories they had half heard but never believed. Another recruit dug deeper, scrolling through citations and commendations. Marksmanship instructor, multiple tours, classified operations. Jesus. He's a ghost. The whispers grew, but not one dared raise their voice above the reverent hush that had settled over the group. It was as if saying too much, too loudly, would somehow break the fragile sanctity of what had just unfolded. Evan Cole, for his part, offered no acknowledgement. He didn't nod when they spoke his name, didn't smile when they whispered his accomplishments. He sat exactly as he had when the day began, quiet, unassuming, sipping from his thermos. The only difference now was the way they looked at him. Ramirez, who only an hour earlier had mocked him, now stood stiff, uncertain. When his turn came to walk past the bleachers toward the debriefing tent, he stopped, hesitated, then snapped a clumsy salute. It wasn't polished, wasn't elegant, but it was honest. Cole returned it with the smallest of gestures, a brief lift of his hand, a nod so slight it might have been missed if you weren't looking. That was enough. By the time the sun began to sink toward afternoon, the recruits all knew who he was, not because he had told them, but because the truth had revealed itself the way truth always does, through action. He hadn't bragged. He hadn't instructed. He hadn't even explained. He had simply stood up, picked up a rifle, and reminded everyone what discipline looked like when it was carved into the marrow of a man. When the rains shut down for the day, Cole didn't linger. He rose, pulled his jacket tighter against the breeze, and walked away. He didn't take the main road. He didn't say goodbye. He simply disappeared behind the maintenance lot, into the part of the base the recruits didn't even have access to. It was only later that they would find the brass plate mounted on Lane 3. No ceremony, no speech. Just one line etched into the metal. 13.2 Cole. And for those who were there that day, no further explanation was ever needed. The recruits returned to the range the next morning, but it didn't feel the same. The sun cut through the early fog as it always did. The targets hung at their usual distances, and Chief Larson barked his orders in the same gravelly cadence. Yet, beneath the surface, something was different. They carried themselves differently. There were fewer jokes, fewer sideways smirks when someone stumbled. Reloads were cleaner, more deliberate. Trigger pulls were slower, steadier. The hesitation replaced with a patience that hadn't been there before. It wasn't fear that changed them, it was respect. They weren't just training anymore. They were measuring themselves against a moment that none of them could quite explain. The brass plate appeared at Lane 3 later that week. Small, almost understated, it bore only a single line. 13.2 Cole. No introduction. No description. Just numbers and a name. At first, Some recruits thought it strange that a record like that would be marked so quietly. No framed photo, no bold lettering, no story carved into stone. But as the weeks passed, they realized that the simplicity of it was the point. Evan Cole hadn't come to be celebrated. He hadn't come to remind them who he was. He had come because something inside him still whispered, "One more time." And when that whisper met the trigger, he left behind a lesson far heavier than applause. The younger men began to talk about him in hushed tones, like speaking his name too loudly might break the spell. They pieced together fragments from searches and old stories. Some remembered his years as an instructor. Others uncovered mentions of missions long since buried in official silence. But the legend that grew among them wasn't built on those reports. It was built on what they had seen with their own eyes. A man who carried silence like a weapon, who spoke only when needed, and who left without waiting for anyone to understand. Ramirez changed the most. Once the loudest voice on the line, he grew quieter after that day. He no longer mocked the ones who hesitated or cracked jokes when the pressure rose. Instead, he watched more, listened more, and carried himself with the kind of restraint that can't be taught in a manual. It wasn't that he was afraid. He had simply learned there was another way to command presence. Silence, he discovered, could cut deeper than words. For Chief Larson and Chief Maddox, the encounter carried a different weight. They had both recognized the faded trident on Cole's sleeve, and both had chosen not to stop him. Some of the recruits wondered later why the instructors had allowed it, why they had stepped aside when normally they controlled every second of the range. Neither Larson nor Maddox ever gave an explanation, but the look they shared when Cole walked away said enough. They understood that they hadn't been watching a man reclaim his past. They had been watching him lay it down. Cole never returned. Not once in the following weeks, not in the months that followed. He had stepped into their world for less than an hour and vanished, leaving only that brass plate behind. And yet, his absence became a presence of its own. The range carried him in its silence, in the way recruits slowed down before pulling the trigger, in the way laughter softened into camaraderie rather than cruelty. Even years later, some of those men would talk about the day the stranger broke the record. They would tell younger recruits about it, never as a boast, but as a reminder. Perfection doesn't need to shout. Strength doesn't always look like muscle or noise. Sometimes it looks like an old man on a bench, sipping burnt coffee, waiting for the moment to remind you that discipline isn't just drilled into you. It lives inside you, if you choose to carry it. Evan Cole's legacy was never carved in marble or framed on a wall. It didn't need to be. His legacy lived in the silence that followed his shots, in the way men who once thought themselves invincible stood humbled, not by force, but by example. And for those who had been there that morning, one truth remained unshakable. Sometimes the most powerful teachers are the ones who never call themselves teachers at all. Cole had walked away as quietly as he had arrived, but none of them ever forgot him. Not because of his record, not because of his name, but because he had shown them something that would shape the rest of their lives. That strength is not swagger. That mastery is not noise. That legends are not crowned. They are remembered in silence.